Hello Fusion Academy, Academy-Deitch here. Prepared a little lesson for you to watch today. Just want to thank you in advance for taking the time to actually sit and watch this. I appreciate it a lot. So without any further ado, let's kind of jump in here. So today what I want to talk about is the American Empire. Now, most of this empire, the empire I guess was at its strongest from the end of the 19th century, which is the end of the 1800s, through sort of World War II area, a couple years after that. But that's sort of the meat and potatoes of when this empire was really its strongest. And you might be thinking to yourself, what American Empire? It's not something that we talk about. It's not something we hear about a lot. I think part of this is sort of to challenge the notion of American exceptionalism, which is a topic that has been in the news recently. A lot of people like to claim that we are this exceptional country. We'll talk more about kind of where that comes from later. But something to think about is this a challenge of the notion of American exceptionalism, or does it go hand in hand, or is there some other reason why we don't talk about it very often? It's an interesting thought, something to think about here. So we're going to kind of start this with December 7th, 1941. So you may already know what I'm going to talk about here. You might have heard the date. You might have heard it's a day that lives in infamy. There's these common tropes that go around that we may have heard before. But on December 7th, 1941, Japan attacked and bombed the military base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Now, it's something that most Americans have heard of. They might not know the date. They might not know all the details of what sank and how many people died and all that stuff. But they know, you hear the word Pearl Harbor, you know exactly what it's talking about. It's what brought the United States into the Second World War. Now, what's important to know is that on December 7th, 1941, almost simultaneously within a few hours, America was attacked 4 other places: the Philippines, Guam, Midway Islands, and Wake Island. Now, probably news to a lot of people here that it wasn't just Pearl Harbor. There's a lot of other places. And what's interesting to know is that at this moment in time, Hawaii had the same legal standing as these other territories. Their territories, which is what we call them now, which basically, to put it bluntly, is sort of a nice way to say a colony. But why do we only know about Hawaii? Why is that the one that sticks out, even though we were attacked in 5 different places all across the Pacific theater? Well, it could be. Hawaii is the only one that actually became a state. It's also the only one that Japan never took control over. We held it the entire time during the war, but Guam, Midway Islands, you may have heard the Battle of Midway. Wake Island might ring a bell as well. And the Philippines all fell to Japan during the Second World War, which is kind of a sign of weakness. But I digress. We talked about exceptionalism a little bit earlier, so I want to kind of dial in on that, and so we understand what that is exactly. So it's a term that we hear all the time. It's a talking point for politicians. You may have heard it in previous education as you're younger, coming up. Your parents may have said, America, we're exceptional. So where does it come from? Well, as far as historians care, it came from a guy named Alexis de Tocqueville. Now, he came to the United States in the 1830s, and he wrote a book called Democracy in America. So the idea here is that what he said is that this American experiment, this Republican government of the people, for the people, by the people, could only have happened right now, or right then, in that moment, in that place, with those people. It can't be duplicated. It's extremely rare. It's never happened before. It will never happen again. That's this exceptionalism, that we are this wonderful experiment, never will happen again. Now, did he actually say that in his readings? I'm not going to make you read Alexis de Tocqueville. I have it somewhere around here. It's a very long, dense. If you've ever read somebody who writes in the 1830s, it's not great. However, it is something that's being debated right now in higher level historical circles. So at the college level, graduate level, we're sort of starting to reread de Tocqueville and say, is that really what he's saying? Or is he kind of joking and belittling this America that he came to found? I mean, he says we have no culture. We have no original culture. Everything's imported. Our ideas are from Greece and Rome, and these ideas of Republican government is nothing really new. However, that's not what's important. What is important is to understand that that's where this term exceptionalism stems from. Whether it's true or not, that's the starting point. And it's followed us through all the way to the present day. But the main thing to understand is that it's a government for the people, by the people, representation. We've heard these tropes before: no taxation without representation. Everyone has an equal say. You're one vote, one person. All these things, we've heard them all. That's American exceptionalism, representation, democracy. Now, so why are we here? Where I'm telling you that we had this empire, it was millions of people. Why do we not know about it? Why don't we talk about it? Well, let's think about this as we go through it. Is it a challenge to American exceptionalism? This idea that we're this great republic for the people, by the people? Is there something else that we're not thinking about that could be the reason? Because we have to keep this in mind. On the eve of Pearl Harbor, 1 out of every 8 people who were under the American flag, meaning that the people who made their laws were in the United States, 1 in 8 people, it's about 12.5%, did not live in the United States. And by the United States, I mean Canada, it's Mexico, Atlantic Ocean, Pacific Ocean, the continental lower 48. That's all that existed at that point. So that's what I'm talking about. 1 in 8 chance that you do not live in that area. It's about 19 million people. So in order to really kind of get a grasp of all of this, we need to go back pretty far. Before even the Civil War, just briefly to kind of get a baseline here of what we're talking about. So it's not a secret. We pushed lots of native tribes off their land. We consolidated them. We moved them. We killed them. There was pandemics, there's smallpox, all these different things, just pure violence, warfare. We took that land. Now, in 1803, Thomas Jefferson made the Louisiana Purchase, which is all that land from the Mississippi west, sort of to where it was Mexico at the time, but this sort of sliver of land. And the idea was that that line, Mississippi west, that's where native tribes, they can have free reign, they can have their own society, there's no laws or anything. Now, it's a great idea. Didn't work. Almost immediately, white settlers start moving in, and eventually we start whittling down where these native tribes can live. And by 1879, every single tribe is consolidated into just a portion of modern-day Oklahoma. So we have to start asking ourselves, is this imperialism? Is this empire building, nation building? Or is this just manifest destiny where we're going to expand eventually? It's just going to happen. So it's debated. It's debated whether taking of native lands is imperialism, empire building, whatever you want to call it, or if it is something other that we don't have a name for, or if it's just sort of a natural process that was going to happen anyway. So we need to think about native tribes in a way that is difficult to think about because of what we've been told and the way it's depicted in media and film and all these different things, that they're all sort of this one band of people with similar customs and traits and governances and things like this, and that's not true at all. When we got here, the people that were on the East Coast, and by we I mean white settlers, people that were on the East Coast, the people that were in the plains, people that were in Oregon, Washington area, completely different people, different rules of governance, different practices and customs and traits, and some were matriarchal, some were patriarchal. There's all these different things, completely different people. It's like comparing India to the United States, right? If we all lived on one continent, we wouldn't still be the same people. It's a different culture altogether. And because of that, we need to, in my opinion, we need to think of this as imperialism and empire building. So it's our first step, it's our first taste as we move from east to west. We start to see this idea that we can sort of take what's ours. It's laying a foundation that will be important for years to come as we start expanding outside of this sort of continental cage that we have. So if there's debate about the Indian country is what it was called. If there's debate about this, one thing that's a little bit less debated is something called the Guano Islands. By guess is that nobody has heard of guano, and that's fine. I didn't hear about it. I had to get a master's degree before I heard of what guano was, or the Guano Islands. But basically, what guano comes down to is bird poop and bat poop. There's no other way to say it. That's what it is. And it turns out that it collects on rocky islands throughout the Pacific and the Caribbean. More on that in a second. But why is guano important, and what are these guano islands? So in the middle of the 1800s, 19th century is more the proper term, 1800s, 19th century, same thing. Middle portion, 1850s or so, leading up into the Civil War. As we were expanding west and we were taking these lands and white settlers are moving into these different regions, the population also increases. So the East Coast, where all the cities are, that population is already increasing. As we start moving west, we start having more space to increase population again. And with this ballooning rate of population, we have a serious issue. That is, how do we feed all of these people? So, brief lesson on 19th century agriculture, but it's not what we think of today. It's not these corporate farms with all these sorts of fertilizers that can just plant and plant and plant, and they don't have to worry about anything. It's quite the opposite. It's much smaller farms where we have to consider the way the land regenerates, the dirt, quite literally the dirt regenerates itself. So what that means is that if I grow corn and I have 100 acres of land, I can't plant all 100 acres every year because my land will be so depleted of nutrients that in a couple years I won't be able to grow anything. So what they did is something called crop rotation. So what that means is if I have 100 acres, I might plant 2/3 of that or 1/3 this year, and then the next year, the next 2/3, and leaving that first third empty so that it can regenerate. And then the next year, that middle third is empty, and the first 2/3 I'm planting with my corn. And the idea is that in that down period, we can regenerate the land and the nutrients can repopulate, and then you can continually grow on the same plot of land over and over again. But when you have a growing population, that becomes a problem because that's land that could be growing food, much needed food, that no longer is in use. So basically what happens is in the middle of the 19th century, in the 1850s or so, we start to discover this thing called guano, which, as I mentioned, bird and bat feces. But it turns out it makes a great fertilizer. So if you just put a little bit of this stuff on your field, it's very high in nitrogen, which is needed to grow plants, and it regenerates or energizes this field, and you can just keep growing on it over and over again. Now, originally guano was found off some islands in the Pacific Ocean off the coast of Peru, which is under control by England. So because of this, and it's because it's a hot commodity throughout the world, it's not just the United States that needs guano, it's the entire world, the prices for it start to become astronomical. It's, think of it like a precious metal. The price just keeps going up because demand is super high for it. So much so that the United States almost went to war over these guano islands. What we did instead is we started looking for our own islands. So basically, right before the Civil War, end of the 1850s or so, we passed a bill that said if we come across an island, a rocky island, there's no people on them, they're just little dots in the ocean, we can claim that as our own. That's our land now. So we started to do this, and little by little, we snatched up all these little tiny islands, mostly Pacific, some in the Caribbean Sea area as well. So much so that by 1902, that's when the last claim was put in for an island, we had 94 of these islands. 94 little rocky pieces of land that were technically the United States. But there's no people or anything like that. However, what did happen on some of these islands, which sort of set up, again, so we're setting a foundation with Indian country, we're going to keep setting this foundation. So what happened is Joe's guano company would go to this island, but I can't do it by myself, so I need to hire workers, usually under coerced conditions where I promise you one thing and I say, oh, actually you're going to scrape bird feces off this island for me and I'm going to pay you very poorly for it. So as you may imagine, This type of treatment leads to revolts. So what happens is this has to go to court in the United States. You know, my workers killed 5 of my white sailors who just sit there while they were scraping the feces up and everything. So I go to court and I say, these guys need to be prosecuted. And the argument is, well, how do we prosecute them if this is not the United States? These are just little rocky islands and everything. And basically what happens is we say, there are some rights, but it's sort of its own jurisdiction. And we can kind of make it up as we go along. So what you see as the Constitution of the United States doesn't necessarily apply here, even though you're flying the United States flag. And that's what's important about the Guano Islands, is it sets this foundation for more populated regions that you're not a U.S. citizen if you're on these islands. You're a colony, you're a territory of the United States, but you don't have all the same rights. So these first 2 instances of empire building are definitely disputed about, is how far or how much we can consider them to be imperialism or empire building. The Guano Islands, yeah, it's sort of a bit of a stretch, but what's important about that is we see that these non-continental United States places are going to have different rules. That's what's important about that. Now, the next couple things we're going to talk about are straight, very easy, very clear imperialism, empire building. So, and this starts to happen towards the end of the 19th century, very, very end. So the Spanish-American War takes place in 1898, and it's between Spain and the United States, hence the name Spanish-American War. It's pretty straightforward. There's no secrets or hidden things about that. But basically, what the Spanish-American War is Cuba is fighting for independence from Spain in the 1890s. The United States supports Cuba's independence, so they send some battleships off the coast of Cuba. One of them is the USS Maine, something you may have heard of. It's docked, moored, anchored, whatever you want to call it, in Havana Harbor. And there's an explosion on the boat, on the ship. And it sinks. Now we know that it was a boiler that exploded and caused the boat to sink. But at the time, we accused Spain of torpedoing the boat as an act of war, which then, of course, set off this war between Spain and the United States. Now, the details of the actual war itself, that's not what we're here to talk about today. So where battles happened, who was involved and everything, that's not really what is important here. What is important, however, is the outcome. So the war is only about 3 months long. Pretty quick, pretty easy. And as a result of this war, there was a Treaty of Paris in 1898, and as a result of this, the United States gained territory, actual territory with people, pretty much for the first time since expanding west and conquering Indian lands. So Puerto Rico, Philippines, and Guam are what they received from Spain as a result of this war. So we're going to talk about 2 of these places. They're the 2 that have the highest population, being the Philippines and Puerto Rico. So the Philippines acquisition was not just, we signed this treaty in Paris, we move on. And Philippines is now a colony of the United States. Not exactly what happened. Philippines didn't want to be colonized. So even after we beat Spain in the Spanish-American War, we had to fight another war against the Philippines. Against your own colony in order to bring them under the umbrella of the United States. Now, that was another relatively quick war. The United States won. But what's important about this one is that this is one of the first instances where the United States goes outside, far outside of the continental United States, across the Pacific Ocean, and conquers land that it clearly has no right to. I mean, there's nothing in dispute there. They probably didn't have any right to the United States. Roosevelt Expansion definitely didn't have any right to this, other than they beat somebody else who claimed that they owned it. It's also the first time that we sort of have to think about how we're treating a non-white population. Indian population, same type of thing. It was already sort of self-determined that we're going to keep them separate, but now we have a new colony, and we're approaching the 20th century, into the 20th century, and we have to figure out how to rule these people. So one of the interesting things that we did was we didn't rule very well. As an example, what happened was we built this something, it was called the White City, and it was 150 miles north of Manila in the city of Baguio, and it was about 5,000 feet above sea level. And the purpose of this was literal separation between the rulers and the ruled. So it was a predominantly white, it was a white city because the buildings were of white stones and everything, and it came from the World Fair in Chicago and everything, not all that important. But that's why it's not called the White City because it was white people, it's called the White City because the buildings were all white. However, it does take on a second name, or a second connotation of that name when you consider that it was only white people, Americans, unless you were some sort of servant or very high-ranking Filipino official, or whatever you would like to call that. The Americans didn't the benefit to the White City was the elevation was much cooler, especially in the summer months when at sea level or closer to sea level. In the Philippines, it's very hot, very humid. You're pretty close to the equator there. So this kind of, it's a metaphorical idea, but it's this physical disconnect where you're literally thousands of feet above the people you're ruling, but it also can kind of, if you think about it, it's this disconnect between the rulers and the ruled. And it was never a smooth period. And Filipinos were never considered Americans. They always had to fight this idea of, are we Filipino, are we American, are we something in between, and it turns out that it was mostly something in between. So it didn't last very long as far as colonies goes. You think the British Empire, it's hundreds of years. This lasted until right after the end of World War II, when it back from Japan, given independence, probably too early without much of a transition, but nevertheless, move on for it. Now the next instance is also from the Spanish-American War, so we're going to talk about Puerto Rico briefly. Puerto Rico is still an American territory, still fighting that battle of where we are as far as citizenship goes, and also another area that's non-white. Something to keep in mind here. So what's interesting about Puerto Rico, and again, this sort of shows the difference between how we rule our own people versus how we rule people that we consider the other, is we had some medical experiments that started to take place in Puerto Rico, and the most notorious was under this guy named Cornelius Rhodes, who in 1932 led some medical experiments so they could compare the different treatments and conditions of the way patients with anemia sort of react to his treatments and everything. Now the problem with that is if he was just treating his patients, that'd be great. But he was specifically and purposely denying treatment to some people who were quite sick and in very bad shape, while helping others purely for his own satisfaction to see how his treatments worked. He also had a role in developing mustard gas, which he thought was going to be a treatment for cancer. Not the case, it's a very deadly gas. But this again, like the Philippines, we have to think about, this is a population of the other. It's Hispanic people in Puerto Rico, it's Filipino people in the Philippines, and the common denominator is they do not get the same treatment that a typical citizen of the United States proper, so now it's the United States plus Hawaii and Alaska, but they're not the same, and that's what we kind of dwell on that for a second here. Now, as we look forward outside of, so after World War II, most of these jurisdictions, you should say, colonies, territories, either went independent or got some sort of more rights. I mean, we still have ownership over places like Puerto Rico, U.S. Virgin Islands, Guam, American Samoa, all these places. Some of them have become states. Hawaii and Alaska became states after the fact in the 40s and 50s. But most of them did not. They either become independent or they just sort of stay in this weird amalgamation, I guess, this weird interplay between whether or not we're states, we're not states, we're Americans, we're not Americans, we're Puerto Ricans, or we're Americans, we're Virgin Islanders, or we're Americans. It's this weird area in between. So we really need to think about why don't we hear about this American empire very often? It's still in play. We still have military bases all around the world. So instead of having physical, masses of people that we control, we learned that that's not that easy, and so now we have military installations all over the country. So if we have hundreds of thousands of people, 100,000 people in Germany, South Korea, Iran, or probably not Iran, Iraq, different places like that, where we can still show our military power, but we don't need to actually care about the people that live in these countries per se. We don't need to write their laws. We don't need to settle disputes or anything. We're just kind of there as, hey, don't forget about us. We're still around here. So we talked about exceptionalism at the beginning of this, and as we can see, imperialism and colonialism is inherently undemocratic. There's nothing democratic about taking over somebody's land and saying that you're ours now and you're going to follow these rules, but you're also not going to have our rights. You're not going to be full citizens. That's a direct challenge to exceptionalism. If we're a government for the people, by the people, then how do we have such a large population, 19 million people by the Second World War? And like I said, that's 12% of the total United States population did not live in the United States. They lived in the Philippines, mostly the Philippines, Puerto Rico. They lived on Guam. They lived on these little islands. They lived in Alaska and Hawaii, which now have been incorporated, obviously. But at the time, it's 12% of your population has almost no say. And that's a shot to American exceptionalism. That's a shot to everything we believe in, everything we hold up. And it's something to keep in mind. American history is really important, and there's a lot of things that we did really well. There's a lot of things that we could be really proud of. There's a lot of things that the United States has been a leader on the world. But it's also important to remember that we're not perfect, and we've done a lot of things that we're not as proud of. We can talk about slavery, we can talk about civil rights issues, and we can talk about colonialism, we can talk about imperialism, we can talk about what we did to the Native American population in this country. And it's important to keep that in the forefront of our minds as we kind of move forward and we think about how we can better our country, how we can better ourselves. We need to know our country's faults and our failures so that I'm still going to include myself in as the younger generation, can strive for a better future. And so that we can understand that we have a checkered past. It's not perfect. American exceptionalism is a great ideal. It's something to strive for, to be exceptional. But it hasn't always been the case. And it probably won't always be the case. So in closing, just want to make sure we understand that our history is important. We have a lot of things we need to consider, a lot of things to look at. There's a lot more I can talk about on the American Empire, obviously, but due to time, we're kind of cutting it short here. But hopefully that's at least a little introduction on where we've been and how we actually have an empire. And anyone who tells you otherwise is not being completely truthful to you, and it's definitely something worth considering a little bit more. If you have any questions, obviously reach out to me about some things that I've said here. I know some of them can be a little bit off-putting or shocking or concerning, but that's what American history is, and it's important to know your history and understand where you come from so that we can figure out where we're going. That's all I have for today. I thank you for watching and everything. Hopefully it wasn't too much going on and on. The only thing I would say is that in an actual class, I would definitely want to have some slideshows and presentation, just to kind of orient ourselves as to where the Philippines is, how far Hawaii is off the coast, some of these other islands, kind of pictures of the Guano Islands is something that I would definitely provide in an actual classroom setting. Unfortunately, my setup here doesn't really allow for that. But obviously in person or over Zoom or Teams or anything like that, I have much more ability to incorporate different slides and things like that. Just because it's easier to visualize when you can, and to understand when you can actually see the distances and where these different things are. But yeah, so that's all I have for today. I appreciate it, and I look forward to hearing from you. Thanks.